Jake Morrison stood at the window of the transport ship and watched the purple sky of Zarian 7 grow larger. His hands were shaking a little as he held his teaching materials. He had never been this far from Earth before, and he had never taught alien students. The Galactic Learning Institute had chosen him from hundreds of human teachers. But now he wondered if they had made a mistake. The ship landed with a soft bump and Jake walked down the ramp. The air smelled different here, like flowers mixed with metal. Strange plants grew everywhere, and they moved slightly even though there was no wind. Two small robots rolled up to him and took his bags without saying anything. Jake followed them toward a tall building that looked like it was made of glass and silver. Inside the building, Jake met Director Yvonne Clark, another human who had been working at the Institute for 5 years. She was tall with gray hair and kind eyes. She showed Jake around the building and explained how things worked. There were students from 12 different planets living and studying here. They all wanted to learn about different species and cultures. Director Clark stopped at a large door and smiled at Jake. She told him his classroom was behind this door and his first class would start in 1 hour. 23 students from different worlds would be waiting for him. She patted his shoulder and said he would do fine, then walked away, leaving Jake alone with his nervous thoughts. Jake opened the door and stepped into his new classroom. The room was bigger than any classroom he had seen on Earth. The ceiling was very high and the walls changed colors slowly from blue to green to purple. There were different types of seats for different types of students. Some seats were tall, some were low, and some looked like they were filled with water. Jake put his books on the teacher's desk and looked around. He had studied about alien species for months before coming here, but seeing the empty classroom made him realize how different this would be from teaching human children back on Earth. He wondered what questions they would ask and if he would have good answers. Students began arriving 30 minutes before class started. The first to enter was Zixtal, a Vorthak female. Jake recognized her immediately from his studies. She was about 6 feet tall with skin that looked like it was made of crystal. Light moved through her skin in patterns that changed based on her mood. Right now her skin was showing light blue patterns, which Jake remembered meant curiosity. She had 4 eyes arranged in a square pattern on her face, and her movements were very precise and careful. Zixtal bowed slightly to Jake and spoke in perfect English. She said she was honored to learn from the first human teacher at the Institute. Her voice sounded like wind chimes. Jake bowed back and thanked her for the welcome. He watched as she took her seat near the front of the classroom and began organizing her note-taking devices on her desk. More students filed in over the next 20 minutes. Mir came next, a Delian who needed to stay partially in water to survive. Her seat was specially designed with a water chamber that kept her lower body wet while allowing her to sit upright. She had smooth blue-green skin and large round eyes that never seemed to blink. When she spoke, her voice made musical sounds. Korth entered the room and had to duck under the doorway. He was a Grimaldi warrior scholar, nearly 8 feet tall, with thick gray skin and small spikes along his arms. Despite his scary appearance, he moved gently and nodded politely to Jake. Before taking his specially reinforced seat at the back of the room, other students continued to arrive. There were small furry creatures called Pixens who chattered constantly in high voices. There were tall thin beings called Etherians who seemed to float slightly above their seats. There were thick-bodied Moltons who reminded Jake of walking rocks. Each species looked completely different, but they all shared the same thing. They were all looking at Jake with great interest and curiosity. When all 23 students had arrived, Jake stood up and introduced himself. He told them he was excited to be their teacher and hoped to help them understand human culture and behavior. He explained that this was his first time teaching aliens and he hoped they would be patient with him as he learned. 2. Zixtal raised her primary hand, which was longer than her other 3 hands. She asked Jake if it was true that humans leaked water from their eyes when they experienced emotional distress. She said she had observed this behavior in human entertainment broadcasts but could not understand its purpose. The crystalline patterns in her skin shifted to bright yellow, which Jake knew meant confusion. Other students began asking questions immediately. Mir wanted to know why humans made loud sounds when they were happy. Korth asked if crying made humans weaker in battle. A small Pixan student squeaked. A question about whether eye leaking was contagious between humans. Jake realized that his students had been studying humans just as much as he had been studying them. They had watched human movies and shows and read human books, but they could not understand the emotional behaviors they observed. To them, human crying looked like a malfunction or disease. Jake smiled and told his students that today's lesson would focus on one of the most important aspects of being human, emotions and how humans express them. He said that by the end of their time together, they would understand not just what human emotions were, but why they existed and how they helped humans survive and build strong communities. The students settled into their seats and activated their various recording devices. Jake could see excitement in their different ways of showing it. Zixtal's skin glowed brighter, Mir's gills fluttered faster, and even serious Korth leaned forward slightly in his massive chair. Jake opened his first book and began what he knew would be the most important and challenging teaching experience of his life. He had no idea that a simple question about crying would lead to discoveries that would change how different species understood each other throughout the galaxy. Jake decided to start with something his students could understand better than direct explanations. He walked over to his desk and picked up a small book of human poetry. The cover was worn and soft from years of use. He had carried this book with him since college, and it contained some of his favorite pieces about human feelings and experiences. He told his class that the best way to understand human emotions was through human stories and poems. These writings, he explained, showed how humans felt about important moments in their lives. Love, sadness, fear, joy, and anger were all captured in these words by humans who wanted to share their feelings with others. Zixtal's crystal skin shifted to a pale green color, which Jake knew meant she was paying very close attention. Her 4 eyes focused on the book in his hands. Mir made soft musical sounds that indicated interest. Even Korth, the large Grimaldi warrior, leaned forward in his reinforced chair. Jake opened the book to a poem about a mother watching her son leave for war. The poem described how proud she felt of his courage, but how scared she was that she might never see him again. As Jake read the words aloud, his voice became softer. The poem reminded him of his own grandfather, who had fought in a war on Earth many years ago. The alien students listened carefully, but Jake could see confusion on their faces. A small Pixan student raised her tiny paw and asked why the mother in the poem would feel 2 different emotions at the same time. In her species, she explained, they only felt one emotion at once, and it was always very clear which one it was. Jake smiled, and explained that humans often felt many emotions together, especially during important moments. This made human feelings very complicated, but also very rich and deep. He turned to another poem, this one about a father teaching his daughter to ride a bicycle. The poem showed how the father felt joy and worry and pride all mixed together as he watched his child learn something new. As Jake read this second poem, he thought about his own father who had taught him to ride a bike when he was 7 years old. His father had run alongside the bike, holding it steady until Jake was ready to ride alone. His voice cracked slightly as he read the line about letting go and trusting that love would keep the child safe. An Etherian student, whose name was Vel, asked why the father in the poem seemed afraid to let his daughter try riding alone. In Etherian culture, young ones were expected to learn independence quickly, and parents did not worry about small dangers. Jake explained that human parents often struggled between wanting their children to grow strong and wanting to protect them from any harm. Jake continued reading poems and short stories to his class. He read about soldiers saying goodbye to their families, about people falling in love, about friends helping each other through difficult times, and about families celebrating happy occasions. With each story, Jake found himself remembering similar moments from his own life. When he read a story about an old man remembering his deceased wife, Jake's throat felt tight. The story described how the man could still smell her perfume in their bedroom and how he kept her coffee cup on the kitchen counter even though she would never use it again. Jake thought about his grandmother, who had died 2 years earlier. He remembered how his grandfather had kept her reading glasses on the table beside her favorite chair. Mia noticed that Jake's voice was becoming different as he read. Her large, round eyes seemed to study his face carefully. She made a questioning musical sound and asked if reading these human stories was causing him some kind of physical discomfort. Jake paused and realized that his eyes were feeling watery. Jake continued with a poem about friendship. It told the story of two friends who had been separated by distance but who never forgot each other. Even after many years apart, when they met again, their friendship was just as strong as before. The poem ended with the line about tears of joy when they embraced after so long apart. As Jake finished reading this poem, he felt a single tear roll down his cheek. He had not expected this to happen. The stories and poems had brought back so many of his own memories and feelings that his body had responded the way human bodies do when emotions become very strong. The classroom became completely silent. Every alien student was staring at Jake with expressions of concern and alarm. Zixtal's crystal skin suddenly flashed bright purple, which Jake knew meant she was experiencing panic or extreme worry. She stood up quickly, her 4 eyes all focused on the wet trail on Jake's face. Zixtal spoke in a voice that was higher than usual, asking the question that would change everything. Professor Morrison, why are your eyes leaking? Are you experiencing system failure? Should we summon medical assistance immediately? Other students began reacting with equal alarm. Mir's musical sounds became sharp and worried. Korth stood up from his chair, ready to help if their teacher was in danger. The small Pixan students were chittering nervously to each other. An Etherian student was already reaching for the emergency communication device on the wall. Jake quickly wiped his eyes and held up his hand to stop the student from calling for help. He realized that what seemed completely normal to him looked like a serious medical emergency to his alien students. In all their studies of human behavior, they had not understood that tears could be something other than a sign of damage or illness. Jake smiled and told his students to sit down. He assured them that he was not sick or broken. What they had just witnessed, he explained, was one of the most important and special things about being human. He said that this moment would help them understand humans better than any textbook or video ever could. The students slowly returned to their seats, but their eyes remained fixed on Jake's face. They were clearly still worried, but also very curious about what their teacher would explain next. Jake could see that this unexpected demonstration had captured their attention completely. Jake set down his poetry book and looked at each of his students. He told them that today they would learn about something that made humans unique among all the species in the galaxy. They would learn about tears and why humans cried, not just when they were hurt or sick, but when they felt emotions so strongly that their bodies had to find a way to release those feelings. The alien students waited quietly, ready to learn about this strange and fascinating human behavior that they had just witnessed firsthand. Jake walked to the front of his desk and sat on the edge so he could be closer to his students. He looked at each worried face and realized this was the perfect teaching moment. Instead of just telling them about human emotions, he could show them exactly what made humans different from other species in the galaxy. He began by explaining that what they had just seen was called crying or weeping. Humans, he told them, released water from their eyes when they felt very strong emotions. These emotions could be sadness, but they could also be happiness, pride, relief, or even anger. The tears were not a sign that something was broken. They were a sign that something was working exactly as it should. Zixtal raised her primary hand and asked how water coming from eyes could be helpful. Her crystal skin was still showing purple worry patterns. She said that in Vorthic biology, losing any fluid from the body was considered wasteful and potentially dangerous. Jake nodded and explained that human tears actually served many important purposes that scientists were still discovering. Jake moved to his teaching screen and activated a video display. He told his students he wanted to show them examples of different types of human crying so they could see how common and normal it was. The first video showed a young woman at a graduation ceremony. She was wearing a black cap and gown and holding a diploma. Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling widely. Mir made confused musical sounds and asked why the human female was leaking water if she appeared to be experiencing joy. Jake paused the video and explained that these were called tears of happiness. The woman had worked very hard for many years to earn her education, and when she finally succeeded, her emotions were so strong that her body responded with tears. The next video showed a man at an airport hugging an older woman. Both of them were crying as they held each other tightly. Jake explained that the man was a soldier returning home from a long deployment, and the woman was his mother. They were crying because they were so happy to be together again after being apart for many months. Korth, the large Grimaldi student, asked if crying made humans weak in battle. In his culture, warriors were expected to show no emotion during conflict. Jake showed another video of soldiers helping their wounded friend to safety. Some of the soldiers had tears in their eyes even as they fought bravely to protect their comrade. Jake explained that crying did not make humans weak. In fact, it often made them stronger because it helped them release stress and connect with others. When humans cried together, it created bonds between them that made their groups more united and more willing to help each other. Small Pixon student squeaked a question about whether humans could control their tears. Jake smiled and admitted that tears often happened without humans wanting them to. Strong emotions could make tears come automatically, even when humans tried to stop them. He said this was different from other body functions that humans could control more easily. Jake showed more videos to demonstrate his point. There was a father crying as he walked his daughter down the aisle at her wedding. There were fans crying with joy when their sports team won an important game. There was an old man crying as he visited a memorial for fallen soldiers. There were children crying when they had to say goodbye to a pet that had died. Vel, the Ethereum student, observed that humans seemed to cry both when good things happened and when bad things happened. She asked how other humans knew what type of crying they were seeing. Jake explained that humans learned to read facial expressions, body language, and the situation around the crying person to understand what emotions were being expressed. Jake decided to demonstrate this by showing two more videos side by side. In one video, a woman was crying at a funeral, surrounded by other sad people dressed in black. In the other video, a woman was crying as she held her newborn baby for the first time, surrounded by smiling family members. Jake asked his students what differences they could see besides the tears. Zixtal's skin shifted to a thoughtful yellow-green as she studied the videos carefully. She pointed out that the crying woman at the funeral had her shoulders curved inward and her head down, while the crying woman with the baby had her face lifted up and was smiling between the tears. Other students began noticing more differences in posture, facial expressions, and the behavior of people around each crying person. Jake was pleased that his students were beginning to understand that human crying was much more complex than just water leaving the eyes. He explained that tears were part of a whole system of human communication that included facial expressions, body language, and vocal sounds. All of these things together told other humans what someone was feeling. Mir asked why humans had developed this water-leaking system when other species had different ways of showing emotions. Jake pulled up images of different alien species expressing feelings. He showed how Vorthic's skin changed colors, how Delians made different musical sounds, and how Grimaldi performed specific movement patterns. Jake explained that each species had evolved different ways to communicate emotions based on their environment and social needs. For humans, tears served multiple purposes. They helped clean and protect the eyes, they released stress hormones from the body, and they sent clear signals to other humans that someone needed comfort or was experiencing intense emotions. The students began asking more questions about the science behind human tears. Jake showed them diagrams of human tear ducts and explained how the brain triggered tear production. He described the different chemicals in tears and how they changed depending on why someone was crying. Tears of sadness had different chemical compositions than tears of joy or tears caused by physical irritation. A molten student, who had been quiet during most of the class, asked if humans ever cried alone when no other humans were around to See. Jake nodded and explained that humans often cried in private as a way to process their emotions. Even when no one else was watching, crying helped humans feel better and think more clearly about their problems. Jake realized that his alien students were beginning to see human tears not as a malfunction or weakness, but as a sophisticated, biological and social system that had helped humans survive and build strong communities for thousands of years. Their confusion was changing into fascination and respect for this uniquely human trait. As the class period was ending, Jake asked his students to observe humans in movies, books, and videos over the next few days and pay attention to when and why they cried. He wanted them to start recognizing the patterns and purposes behind human tears before their next lesson. Jake walked into his classroom the next day and found his students already waiting for him. They looked excited and eager to share what they had discovered. Zixtal's crystal skin was glowing with bright orange patterns, which Jake knew meant enthusiasm. Mir was making cheerful musical sounds that filled the room with pleasant melodies. Even Sirius Korth seemed more animated than usual. Before Jake could say good morning, Zixtal raised her primary hand and asked if she could share her observations about human tears. Jake smiled and invited her to speak. Zixtal stood up and explained that she had watched 12 different human movies the previous night. She had noticed that humans cried in many different situations that she had not expected. Zixtal described a movie where humans cried when they laughed very hard at something funny. She found this especially puzzling because on her home planet, pleasure and distress were completely separate experiences. Jake explained that humans sometimes cried from laughter when something was extremely funny, and these tears were actually a release of joy and amusement. Mir raised one of her fin-like hands and made a series of musical notes that Jake had learned meant she wanted to ask a question. She had observed humans crying during what appeared to be fictional stories, even though they knew the events were not real. She wondered why humans would have emotional responses to imaginary situations. Jake was impressed by her observation and explained that humans had very active imaginations. When they watched movies or read books, they could feel emotions as if the events were really happening. This ability to empathize with fictional characters was one of the things that made human storytelling so powerful and important to their culture. Small Pixan student chittered excitedly and said she had watched a human documentary about animals. She saw humans crying when they watched baby animals being born and when they saw injured animals being healed. She asked why humans would have emotional responses to creatures from different species. Jake felt proud of his students for making such careful observations. He explained that humans had developed strong feelings of compassion not just for other humans, but for many different types of living creatures. This empathy extended beyond their own species, which was unusual in the galaxy but had helped humans become successful at working with other life forms. Korth stood up slowly and announced that he had something important to share. The large Grimaldi warrior looked uncomfortable as he explained that he had watched human war movies to understand if crying made soldiers weak in battle. What he found surprised him. He saw that human soldiers often fought more fiercely when they were emotional. Not less fiercely, Korth described a scene where human soldiers cried for their fallen friends, but then fought harder to protect the remaining members of their unit. He said that in Grimaldi culture, warriors were taught that emotions interfered with combat effectiveness. But human warriors seemed to draw strength from their emotions, including their tears. Jake nodded and explained that human emotions, including crying, often motivated people to take action rather than making them passive. Grief could inspire humans to fight for justice. Love could give them courage to protect others. Even fear could help them make smart decisions to stay alive and keep their loved ones safe. An Etherean student named Vel floated slightly higher in her seat and asked about the physical effects of crying on human bodies. She had read that human tears contained stress hormones and that crying actually changed the chemistry inside human brains. Jake was impressed that she had done such detailed research. Jake confirmed that crying did indeed have measurable effects on human biology. When humans cried, their bodies released chemicals that helped them feel calmer and think more clearly. The salt water that came from their eyes also helped clean out toxins and stress hormones. In many ways, crying was like a reset button for human emotional systems. The students began sharing more observations and asking deeper questions about human emotional responses. They had noticed that humans often cried in groups, and that seeing one person cry often made other humans cry too. Jake explained that this was called emotional contagion, and it was one of the ways that human communities stayed connected and supportive of each other. Jake decided to take the lesson further by asking his students to share how their own species expressed strong emotions. He wanted them to see that while the methods were different, the need to communicate feelings was universal among intelligent species. Zixtal went first, explaining how Vorthok's skin changed colors and patterns to show their inner emotional states. She demonstrated by shifting her skin from the orange of enthusiasm to the blue-green of curiosity to the soft pink of contentment. She explained that Vorthok could not hide their emotions the way humans sometimes could because their skin always revealed their true feelings. Mir created a series of musical sounds to demonstrate Delian emotional expression. Low, slow notes indicated sadness or worry. High, fast notes showed excitement or joy. Complex harmonies were used to express love or deep satisfaction. She explained that Delian communities often sang together to share emotions and create group harmony. Korth performed a brief Grimaldi emotion display, which involved specific movements of his arms and changes in his posture. Straight, rigid movements showed determination or anger. Flowing, curved movements indicated peace or contentment. Quick, sharp movements expressed alertness or concern. He said that Grimaldi warriors used these movement patterns to communicate. Silently during battle, the small Pixen students chattered together in their high voices, creating complex patterns of sound that conveyed different emotional messages. An Etherian student demonstrated how her species changed the intensity of their natural glow to express feelings. The Molten student showed how his thick, rock-like skin could shift texture to indicate his emotional state. Jake realized that his classroom was becoming a place of true cultural exchange. Each species was learning not just about humans, but about each other. The students were discovering that while their methods of emotional expression were very different, the underlying feelings and the need to communicate those feelings were remarkably similar across all their species. As the students continued sharing and asking questions, Jake noticed something wonderful happening. They were beginning to see human crying not as a strange malfunction, but as one valid method among many for expressing and managing emotions. They were starting to appreciate the complexity and usefulness of human tears. Jake assigned his students a new project for the following day. He asked them to work in small mixed groups to create presentations, comparing emotional expression across their different species. He wanted them to find similarities and differences, and to think about how understanding these differences could help different species work together better. The students left the classroom talking excitedly among themselves, already forming groups and planning their presentations. Jake watched them go and felt satisfied that they were truly beginning to understand what made humans special while also appreciating their own unique qualities. 3 months had passed since that first day when Zixtal had asked Jake why his eyes were leaking. The classroom had become a place where 23 alien students and one human teacher had learned to understand each other in ways that surprised everyone. Today was their final class together, and Jake could feel his emotions building as he looked at the faces that had become so familiar to him. The students had prepared final presentations about their research into human emotional expression and how it compared to their own species. Jake watched as each group stood up to share what they had learned. The presentations were thoughtful and detailed, showing how much his students had grown in their understanding of human nature. Zixtal's group had created a detailed chart comparing the biological purposes of emotional expression across 6 different species. She explained that human tears served as both a physical release mechanism and a social communication tool, similar to how Vorthok's skin color changes served both individual regulation and group communication functions. Her crystal skin glowed with confident blue patterns as she spoke. Mir's group had composed a musical presentation that demonstrated how different species use sound, color, movement, and yes, even tears, to convey emotional information. The Delium student created haunting melodies that somehow captured the feeling of human sadness, then shifted to joyful harmonies that expressed human happiness. Other students in her group added their own species sounds to create a symphony of interspecies emotional expression. Korth's group had focused on the practical applications of understanding emotional expression in diplomatic and military situations. The large Grimaldi warrior explained how knowing that human tears could indicate determination rather than weakness would change how his people approached negotiations with humans. He said that Grimaldi warriors would now see crying human soldiers as potentially more dangerous rather than less dangerous opponents. Each presentation showed Jake that his students had moved far beyond simply learning facts about human crying. They had developed a deep appreciation for the complexity and value of emotional expression in all its forms. They understood that what might seem strange or inefficient to one species could be perfectly logical and useful to another. As the presentations ended, Jake stood up to give his final lesson. He had prepared remarks about cultural understanding and the importance of looking beyond surface differences to find common ground. But as he looked at his students, all the words he had planned seemed inadequate for what he was feeling. Jake began to speak about how much he had learned from teaching them. He explained that when he first arrived at the Galactic Learning Institute, he had thought his job was simply to teach aliens about humans. But over the past months, he had discovered that the real learning had been mutual. His students had taught him just as much about empathy, curiosity, and the universal desire to understand others. As Jake continued talking, he found himself thinking about all the moments they had shared together. He remembered Zixtal's careful questions and her gradual shift from seeing tears as a malfunction to recognizing them as a sophisticated communication system. He thought about Mir's musical interpretations of human emotions, and how she had helped him understand that feelings could be expressed in ways he had never imagined. Jake's voice began to change as he spoke about Korth's evolution from seeing emotion as weakness to understanding it as a source of strength. He talked about the small Pixan students who had shown him that curiosity and enthusiasm were universal languages that transcended species boundaries. He mentioned the Etherian and Molten students who had helped him see his own humanity from completely new perspectives. As Jake continued his farewell speech, he felt his throat tightening with emotion. These alien students had become more than just pupils to him. They had become friends and teachers and bridges to understanding species he had only read about in textbooks. The thought of leaving them and returning to Earth filled him with a mixture of sadness and gratitude that was almost overwhelming. Jake paused in his speech and felt the familiar sensation of tears forming in his eyes. This time, however, he did not try to hide them or explain them away. Instead, he let them come naturally as he continued talking about what the past months had meant to him. One tear rolled down Jake's cheek as he explained how proud he was of each student's growth and understanding. Then another tear followed, as he described how they had changed his own perspective on teaching and learning. By the time he was talking about how much he would miss their questions and insights, tears were flowing freely down his face. The classroom was completely silent, but this time there was no alarm or concern in the silence. Instead, Jake could see understanding and recognition in every alien face. Zixtal's skin had shifted to a warm golden color that Jake had learned meant deep emotional connection. Mir was creating soft, supportive musical tones. Korth was sitting perfectly still in a Grimaldi posture that indicated respect and honor. Zixtal slowly stood up from her seat and walked to the front of the classroom. She stopped in front of Jake and looked directly at him with all four of her eyes. In a clear, confident voice, she made an announcement to the entire class. Zixtal explained that their professor's eyes were leaking because his emotional processing centers were overwhelmed with pride, gratitude, and affection for his students. She said that this was a normal and healthy human response to experiencing strong positive emotions during important life transitions. She told the class that Jake's tears were not a sign of distress but a sign of how much their learning journey together had meant to him. The other students began responding in their own ways. Mir created a complex harmony that seemed to wrap around Jake like a musical hug. Korth stood and performed a brief Grimaldi honor salute. The Pixan students chattered supportively among themselves. The Etherian students' glow became warmer and brighter. Even the usually quiet Molten student's rocky skin shifted to show approval and understanding. Jake wiped his eyes and smiled at his incredible students. He realized that the question, "Why are your eyes leaking?" had become so much more than just a curious inquiry about human biology. It had become the beginning of a journey that had taught all of them about the beauty and value of emotional expression, the importance of looking beyond surface differences, and the universal nature of connection and understanding. In his final report to the Galactic Learning Institute, Jake wrote that while humans might be unique in how they cried, the capacity for emotional growth, empathy, and cross-species understanding existed in all intelligent beings. Sometimes it just took patience, openness, and yes, a few tears to discover it. The simple act of crying had built bridges between worlds and shown that curiosity and compassion were truly universal languages that could unite any species willing to learn from each other.